The President of the United States just called the Prime Minister of Canada a governor, not by accident, not once, 7 times. And within 48 hours, the lights started going out in America. This is not a political debate. This is a power grid emergency unfolding in real time, and most Americans have no idea it is happening because no one is telling them where their electricity actually comes from. Stay with this because by the end, you will understand something about American energy vulnerability that your utility company, your senator, and your federal government have never once explained to you. Mark Carney is the elected head of a sovereign G7 nation, a country of 40 million people, the second largest nation on Earth by land area, a founding NATO member, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, a country that has fought alongside America in every major conflict for over a century. Donald Trump, at a press conference addressing Canada's latest round of economic actions, referred to him as governor. Not once in passing, 7 deliberate times. Little Governor Carney, the governor of Canada. He's basically a governor. We have 50 of those. Some of them are much better. Canada is a nice place, but at the end of the day, it is like a state. And the governor up there needs to remember who the real leader of this continent is. Every repetition was a calculation. Every repetition delivered the same message. Canada is not a nation. It is an American subdivision. Its leader is not a peer. He is a regional administrator who exists within the American hierarchy. If you are finding this analysis valuable, tap subscribe right now, because we update this situation daily, and the next development is one most people will not see coming. Diplomatic analysts did not treat this as name-calling. They treated it as something more precise and more dangerous, because calling a head of government governor has a specific meaning in the vocabulary of colonial administration. Governors served at the pleasure of imperial capitals. They administered territories on behalf of distant sovereigns. They exercised authority that was delegated, not sovereign. To call the Prime Minister of Canada governor is to imply that Canadian authority is delegated from Washington, that Canadian sovereignty exists at American pleasure, that the relationship between the two nations is not a partnership between equals, but a hierarchy in which one party governs and the other administers. The French Foreign Ministry called the language incompatible with the norms of diplomatic address between sovereign nations. The British government issued a statement affirming that Prime Minister Carney holds the same sovereign standing as any head of government anywhere on Earth. 31 nations issued formal diplomatic objections within 72 hours. But Carney did not respond with a statement. He did not respond with a press conference. He did not respond with diplomacy. He responded with electricity. Or more precisely, with the decision about how much of it would cross the border. Here is what almost no American knows. Hydro-Quebec is the largest electricity generator in North America. It operates 63 hydroelectric generating stations across Quebec, with over 37,000 megawatts of installed capacity. It supplies approximately 70 to 75% of Vermont's total electricity under normal operating conditions. It supplies between 30 and 50% of New Hampshire and Maine's electricity during peak demand periods. It underpins the entire New England grid through interconnections at the Highgate Converter Station, the Phase 2 high-voltage direct current line, and the recently completed New England Clean Energy Connect. 6 American states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, built their energy infrastructure across 6 decades on the assumption that Canadian hydroelectric power would flow continuously, cheaply, and without political interruption. That assumption held for 60 years. It took one word to break it. Within 48 hours of Trump's press conference, Hydro-Quebec announced a priority reallocation of generation capacity to Canadian domestic consumers during a period of elevated national demand. The language was identical to standard utility operational communications during high-demand periods, which meant no American trade body, no regulatory agency, no executive order could challenge it as a political act. The practical effect was that electricity exports to New England through the cross-border transmission interconnections were reduced to approximately 30% of normal flow. Not a full cutoff, a throttle, precise, calibrated, and economically devastating. Manitoba Hydro and British Columbia's BC Hydro followed within 24 hours, reducing exports to American border states in the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. Ontario reduced electricity exports to New York and Michigan through identical operational frameworks. 4 provincial utilities, each operating independently under provincial jurisdiction, each framing the reduction in standard operational language. And the result was a coordinated national energy posture shift that no single American regulatory body, no executive order, and no diplomatic communication could address, reverse, or appeal. ISO New England, the independent system operator responsible for managing the regional electricity grid, activated emergency operating procedures within 6 hours of the Hydro-Quebec announcement. The protocol that authorizes grid operators to request voluntary conservation, activate demand response programs, and prepare for involuntary load shedding, the technical term for rolling blackouts. Vermont issued public conservation appeals immediately. New Hampshire and Maine followed within hours. And then the prices moved. Wholesale electricity prices across the New England grid tripled overnight, from approximately $50 per megawatt hour to over $150, with spot prices during peak demand hours spiking above $300, as grid operators competed for every available megawatt from American generators already running at or near maximum capacity. The attempt to replace lost Canadian hydroelectric imports by ramping up gas-fired generation immediately strained the region's already constrained natural gas pipeline infrastructure. Natural gas prices spiked simultaneously. Electricity bills and heating fuel bills across 6 states escalated together, from the same single cause in the same 48-hour window. Energy analysts called it the most severe grid cost crisis in New England since the polar vortex events of 2014 and 2018, with one critical difference. Those events were caused by weather and lasted days. This event was caused by a presidential insult and had no defined end date. Do not go anywhere. Because what happened next inside the White House and on a conference call between 6 American governors is the part of this story that the administration does not want discussed publicly. Trump's response came within hours and confirmed what every previous confrontation in this series had suggested, but never proven this directly. The administration had no mechanism to reverse what Canada had done. He threatened to shut off Canadian energy imports. His own energy secretary contradicted him in a public statement, explaining that shutting off Canadian energy imports was precisely the problem the administration was trying to solve, not a tool available to solve it. He threatened tariffs on Canadian electricity. Trade lawyers and energy regulators simultaneously noted that tariffs on Canadian electricity would raise costs for the American consumers already experiencing the crisis, effectively punishing his own constituents for a Canadian utility's operational decision. He demanded that American utilities find alternative sources immediately. ISO New England's CEO responded in a rare public statement. There are no other sources at the scale required within any time frame that addresses the current situation. New England's grid was designed around Canadian hydroelectric imports. Redesigning it requires a decade and tens of billions of dollars. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission confirmed what had now become the defining structural reality of the crisis. It has no jurisdiction over Canadian generation facilities and no authority to compel Canadian electricity exports. The leaked governor conference call changed the political temperature entirely. New England's 6 governors, Republicans and Democrats together, held an emergency call within 36 hours of the energy reduction. The contents reached political press through multiple participants within 24 hours. The governor of Vermont, whose state was most acutely affected, asked the group directly, "How do we explain to our constituents that their electricity bills just tripled because the president called the Prime Minister of Canada a governor?" A border state governor responded, "The president called him a governor. Now he is governing our electricity. I do not know how we explain that because I do not understand it myself." The governor of Massachusetts said, "I need the federal government to stop insulting the man who controls our power supply and start negotiating with him. My state cannot function at these electricity prices for another week." The joint gubernatorial statement that followed, signed by all 6 governors, bipartisan, released publicly, demanded immediate federal diplomatic engagement and a fundamental reassessment of the rhetorical posture that had produced the crisis. And then Carney stood inside Hydro-Quebec's main control center in Montreal. The setting was the operational nerve center of North America's largest electricity generator, a room of massive screens showing real-time power flow data across the northeastern grid, generation output from 63 hydroelectric stations, transmission flow through every cross-border interconnection, and the precise megawatt volumes entering and not entering American territory at that exact moment. The data was the statement before Carney opened his mouth. He was flanked by the premiers of Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia, Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador, every major hydroelectric producing province in the country, and by the CEOs of Hydro-Quebec, Manitoba Hydro, BC Hydro, and Ontario Power Generation. This was not one leader acting alone. This was an entire national energy establishment executing a coordinated sovereign posture. Carney spoke about Canadian hydroelectric power as a sovereign resource, generated on Canadian rivers by Canadian dams through Canadian investment under Canadian operational authority. He spoke about the commercial nature of cross-border electricity sales. Canadian electricity flows into American grids not by treaty obligation, not by alliance commitment, not by any legal requirement, but by commercial agreement between Canadian utilities and American grid operators. Agreements that exist at the pleasure of the Canadian generators who produce the power. And that can be adjusted through standard operational procedures at any time, for any reason, without recourse to any American regulatory body. He addressed the insult directly, calmly, and with a composure that made what came next land harder than any raised voice could have. I want to address a word that was used by the President of the United States to describe me. The word was governor. The implication was that Canada is a state, that its leader is a regional administrator who serves within the American hierarchy. Then he paused. Then he gestured to the screens behind him, the real-time data, the generation numbers, the transmission volumes, the precise megawatt flows showing exactly how much Canadian electricity was and was not crossing into American territory at that moment. Behind me are the operational controls of the largest electricity generating system in North America. The power flowing from these stations through these transmission lines across these interconnections keeps the lights on in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and parts of New York. That power is generated in Canada, on Canadian rivers, through Canadian infrastructure, under Canadian authority. No American government controls it. No American regulator can compel it. No American president can order it restored through any executive instrument available to the office. Then the pause that everyone who watched it described as the longest moment in the series. Then 11 words. He called me governor. Ask New England who governs their power. The phrase trended globally within 3 minutes, faster than any previous defining moment in the entire series. Because the irony required no explanation. It was immediately understandable in any language, in any context, to anyone who encountered it. The Financial Times ran it as a standalone quote beneath a photograph of the Hydro-Quebec control room. Bloomberg titled its analysis, "The Governor Who Governs American Electricity." The Wall Street Journal's editorial board published a piece headlined, "The Most Expensive Insult in American History." And the secondary wave of attention that followed, as viewers who had never followed any previous chapter of this story discovered it through 11 words that needed no context beyond themselves, produced the largest single-day viewership expansion in the series. But here is what the irony obscures. The dependency that made this moment possible is not temporary. It is not the result of one bad policy decision. It is the result of 6 decades of grid design that assumed Canadian hydroelectric power would always be there. Vermont imports approximately 70 to 75% of its electricity from Hydro-Quebec. New Hampshire and Maine import between 30 and 50% during peak demand periods. New England's own generation fleet, diminished by coal plant closures, nuclear retirements at Vermont Yankee and Pilgrim, and the chronic constraint of natural gas pipeline capacity into the region, cannot replace Canadian hydroelectric imports at any price within the existing infrastructure. This is not a crisis that ends when the diplomatic temperature drops. This is a structural condition that persists regardless of who is president or what any future negotiation produces. Because the transmission interconnections, the generation capacity, and the 6 decades of grid architecture cannot be unwound by executive order, diplomatic statement, or anything other than the kind of decade-long infrastructure investment that has not begun and has not been funded. The power has not been restored to normal levels. The prices have not returned to baseline. The 6 governors are still waiting for a federal response that addresses the actual structural problem rather than the political surface of it. And the man the President of the United States called a governor is still the one deciding how much electricity crosses the border every single day. If this is the first time you are seeing this story, every previous chapter is in the feed. The structural dependency, the trade realignment, the infrastructure bypass, the agricultural pivot, every piece that built to this moment is documented and waiting. Drop your reaction in the comments. We read every one, and the question we are seeing most right now is whether this energy posture shift becomes permanent or whether it returns to baseline once the diplomatic pressure eases. That answer is coming in the next update. If you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. We do not cover the noise. We cover the structure underneath it, daily. And the next development in this situation is already in motion.